the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, where millions of lives are ground into dust between two merciless ideologies. A single captured soldier becomes the ultimate prize. He is Yakov D. Zhugashvili, an artillery lieutenant whose true value lies not in his rank, but in his blood. He is the first and forsaken son of Joseph Stalin, the absolute ruler of Soviet Russia. Now, he sits in a German cage, a pawn in a game of empires. And Adolf Hitler, seeing a chance to shatter his enemy's will, makes a breathtaking offer. Trade this son for a captured field marshal. The world holds its breath, waiting for a father's response. But in the heart of the Kremlin, a choice is made that will echo through history. A choice between a son and a state, between a father's heart and a tyrant's duty. This is not just a story of war, but of a sacrifice so cold, so calculated, it would define the soul of a nation and seal one man's terrible fate. What does a leader owe his family? What does a man owe his father? And what is the true cost of absolute power? The earth trembled not with spring thaw, but with the iron tread of panzer divisions. It was June 22, 1941, and Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history, had torn a bloody scar across the western border of the Soviet Union. For Lieutenant Yakov D. Zhugashvili, a junior officer in the 14th Howitzer Artillery Regiment of the 14th Armored Division, the war began as a deafening roar of confusion and collapsing front lines. The Luftwaffe owned the skies, strafing and bombing with impunity. German spearheads, employing their devastating blitzkrieg tactics, sliced through Soviet defenses, encircling entire armies in vast pockets that would become slaughterhouses. In this maelstrom, the individual soldier was a speck of dust, and Yakov, for all the weight of his name, was no exception. He was simply one man with a commander's pistol and a map, trying to impose order on the chaos. That name, D. Zhugashvili, was both a shield and a prison. He had spent his entire life running from the colossal shadow of the man who had abandoned the name for the revolutionary nom de guerre, Stalin, man of steel. Yakov was not the son of Stalin. He was the son of Joseph Zhugashvili, the fiery young Georgian seminarian who had once shown his first wife, Yakov's mother, a tenderness the world would never again see from him. Ekaterine Kato Svanidze had died of typhus when Yakov was just an infant, and with her passed any softness in his father's heart. What remained was a hardened revolutionary who saw his son as a distraction, a reminder of a personal loss he could not afford. Sent to live with his aunt in Tbilisi, Yakov grew up distant, both geographically and emotionally, from the ascendant figure in the Kremlin. Their relationship was a chronicle of disappointment. When Yakov finally moved to Moscow in the late 1920s, he was a quiet, sensitive young man thrown into the viper's nest of the Stalin household. He clashed bitterly with his stepmother, Nadezhda Alilayeva, and his father's constant, corrosive disdain was a poison. The breaking point came in a trivial, yet devastating argument. Stalin mocked him, perhaps over a failed romance or a perceived weakness. The exact words are lost, but their impact is etched in history. That night, in the kitchen of their Kremlin apartment, Yakov D. Zhugashvili took a small pistol and shot himself. The bullet tore through his chest but failed to kill him. His father's reaction upon visiting him in the hospital was not concern but contempt. Stalin was reported to have sneered. He couldn't even shoot straight. The message was clear. In the family of the man of steel, there was no room for vulnerability, for failure, for what he saw as theatrical despair. Yakov had tried to escape the shadow and had only been buried deeper within it. He found a measure of redemption, or perhaps simply an escape, in the army. He studied artillery, a technical, mathematical trade that demanded precision and offered a clear chain of command, a structure so absent from his family life. When the war came, it was a chance to prove himself, not as Stalin's son, but as a Soviet citizen. He did not seek special treatment. If anything, he seemed to embrace the anonymity and shared hardship of the front. He ate the same thin gruel, slept in the same muddy dugouts, and felt the same primal fear as the peasants and factory workers who made up his battery. The early days of July 1941 found his unit reeling back from the border, part of the shattered Western Front trying to form a new defensive line near Vipsk, in the path of Army Group Center's relentless advance. 1,000 miles to the west, in the Wolf's Lair, his deep forest headquarters in East Prussia, Adolf Hitler pored over maps, his eyes alight with fanatical certainty. The initial successes of Barbarossa had confirmed his ideological worldview. The Untermenschen, the subhuman Slavs, were crumbling before the master race. But his obsession was not just with territory, it was with annihilation. He spoke of Moscow and Leningrad being wiped from the face of the earth. And his special, virulent hatred was reserved for one man, Joseph Stalin, the archpriest of Judeo-Bolshevism. In Hitler's mind, this was a war of existential extermination, a crusade against a demonic foe. The capture of a mere lieutenant, even one named D. Zhugashvili, was not yet on his radar. That news was working its way up the chain of command, from a bewildered battalion intelligence officer to a corps commander, who immediately understood the seismic potential of the prisoner taken near the village of Lyazno. Back in the Kremlin, Stalin was grappling with a catastrophe of his own making. He had ignored a mountain of intelligence warning of the imminent invasion, dismissing it as British misinformation designed to drag him into the war. Now, his purged officer corps, decimated of its most experienced leaders in the late 1930s, was proving incapable of managing the retreat. Cities he had vowed to defend were falling in weeks. The air was thick with the smell of treason and failure. It was in this atmosphere of paranoia and crisis that he drafted and signed the infamous Order No. 270, dated August 16, 1941. It was read aloud to every Red Army unit. Commanders and political workers who during battle tear off their insignia and desert to the rear or surrender to the enemy are to be considered malicious deserters, whose families are to be arrested as the families of oath breakers and traitors. The order was absolute, merciless, and universal. There were no exceptions. A soldier who surrendered was a traitor. His family would share his punishment. It was a doctrine of collective guilt designed to terrify his own troops into fighting to the death. He signed this decree, this law that would condemn hundreds of thousands, knowing his own son was already missing in action, his fate unknown. Was it a preemptive act of political hardening, a brutal, calculated move to show that even the Vajd's own family was subject to the state's unforgiving justice? Or was it the final, cold severing of a bond that had never truly been there? As the order was disseminated, creating a climate of fear that would haunt every Soviet soldier for the rest of the war, Stalin received the confirmation he must have dreaded. A German propaganda leaflet, fluttering down over Soviet positions, featured a grainy photograph. It showed a haggard, defeated-looking Yakov D. Zhugashvili, surrounded by smiling German officers. The caption dripped with venom. "This is Yakov D. Zhugashvili, Stalin's eldest son. If the son of the great Stalin surrenders, then your fight is hopeless. Follow his example." The private tragedy was now a public weapon. The son was in the hands of the father's most hated enemy, and the stage was set for a confrontation that would strip bare the brutal logic of total war. Where love and blood were currencies the state could not afford to spend. The shadow of the giant had finally consumed the sun, and from the depths of a German POW camp, Yakov's long, shame-filled calvary was just beginning. The world of a prisoner of war is a world shrunken to the dimensions of a cage, a universe defined by barbed wire, hunger, and the crushing weight of helplessness. For Yakov D. Zhugashvili, transferred from a frontline interrogation center to the special officers' camp at Hammelburg, this new existence was a particular kind of hell. His capture was not just a personal failure. It was a national scandal, a propaganda coup for the enemy, and a blatant violation of his father's own draconian decree. The other Soviet officers in the camp, hardened men who had seen their divisions annihilated, regarded him with a mixture of awe, suspicion, and outright hostility. To some, he was a living reminder of the hypocrisy at the top, The son of the man who declared all surrendering soldiers traitors was now himself the most famous traitor of all. To others, he was a cursed figure, his presence a magnet for the attention of the camp guards and the ever-watchful Gestapo. The Germans, for their part, were initially ecstatic. They had bagged the ultimate trophy. Yakov was subjected to a relentless, multi-layered interrogation process. First came the military intelligence officers of the Abwehr, men with crisp uniforms and clinical minds. They spread maps before him, asking about unit dispositions, the morale of the Red Army, the locations of command centers. Yakov, trained and proud of his artillery knowledge, gave them nothing of value. He gave his name, rank, and serial number, a stoic resistance that frustrated his captors. Then came the propagandists, a different breed altogether. These were men from Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. They offered him cigarettes, better food, and comfortable quarters. They posed him for photographs, sometimes with cooperative pals, sometimes alone, always with his face a mask of dejection. They promised him a role in a liberated Russia, a comfortable life if he would only denounce his father's regime in a radio broadcast. This was the subtlest torture. Yakov, who had spent a lifetime wrestling with his feelings for his father, was now being asked to weaponize them. The internal conflict must have been agonizing. To publicly repudiate Stalin would be the ultimate betrayal, not just of a father he resented, but of the motherland he had sworn to defend. It would validate every German claim about the rotten core of the Soviet system. Yet to refuse was to condemn himself to the continued misery of the camp, and perhaps to death. He held firm. He refused to make any statements. The propaganda leaflets, however, needed no signature. His image, captured and decontextualized, was doing the work for them. Millions of copies were printed and air dropped over Soviet lines. "Look, the son of your great leader, he surrendered. He is alive and in our hands. Why are you still fighting?" In Moscow, the silence from the Kremlin was deafening. The Soviet propaganda machine, a vast and sophisticated apparatus run by men who lived in terror of Stalin's displeasure, went into overdrive to contain the damage. The official line was absolute denial. Pravda and Izvestia made no mention of Yakov's capture. Instead, they filled their pages with stories of heroic last stands and partisan bravery. The narrative was one of universal, unyielding resistance. To acknowledge that Stalin's son was a POW would shatter this carefully constructed illusion. Behind the scenes, however, the NKVD was working furiously. They arrested Yakov's wife, the ballerina Yulia Meltzer, under Order No. 270. She was thrown into the Lubyanka, interrogated as a potential conspirator, a wife of a traitor. It was a brutal, predictable act, a performance of ruthlessness designed to prove that the law applied to all, even the Vajd's own family. Stalin himself never publicly uttered Yakov's name. In private, according to some accounts from those in his inner circle, he grumbled that his son had behaved like a coward and disgraced him. The war, meanwhile, ground on with a savagery that dwarfed any individual's fate. The German advance slowed, then stalled in the frozen suburbs of Moscow in December 1941. The Red Army's desperate counteroffensive bought a reprieve. But the following summer, the Wehrmacht launched its Case Blue offensive, driving deep into the Caucasus and toward the Volga River. The focal point of the entire war became a city that would forever bear Stalin's name, Stalingrad. Here, in the rubble of factories and along the banks of the great river, a battle of unprecedented ferocity erupted. It was a fight for every street, every house, every staircase. The Soviet 62nd Army, under General Vasily Chuikov, was pushed to the brink of annihilation, but held on with a tenacity that shocked the Germans. By November 1942, the situation for the Germans in Stalingrad had become desperate. The entire Sixth Army, a force of nearly 300,000 men, under the command of Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, was encircled by a massive Soviet counteroffensive. Operation Uranus. In his headquarters, a stuffy bunker in the shattered city, Paulus watched his supplies of food, fuel, and ammunition dwindle to nothing. The Luftwaffe's attempts to supply him by air were a catastrophic failure. His men were starving, freezing, and running out of bullets. Hitler, from his distant wolf's lair, radioed orders demanding Paulus fight to the last man, to die a hero's death for the fatherland. He even promoted him to field marshal in the faint hope that he would then commit suicide, as no German field marshal had ever surrendered. But on January 31, 1943, Friedrich Paulus, the meticulous, hesitant aristocrat, defied his Führer. He surrendered. The news was a thunderclap around the world. In Berlin, it was a catastrophe. In Moscow, it was the turning point of the war, a symbol of victory snatched from the jaws of defeat. It was in the aftermath of this seismic event that Hitler, fuming in his East Prussian headquarters, conceived of a move that was part gambit, part psychological warfare masterstroke. The humiliation of Stalingrad needed a response. The loss of a field marshal, a symbol of German military prestige, demanded a counter-symbol. His eyes turned to the high-value prisoner languishing in a camp. He would trade the lieutenant for the field marshal, the son for the commander. The logic was twisted but potent. It was an offer designed to trap Stalin. If he accepted, he would be exposed as a hypocrite, a man who placed his own family above the state, undermining the very doctrine of sacrifice he had imposed on his people. If he refused, he would be revealed as a monster, a man so cold he would let his own son die. Through the neutral channels of the International Red Cross, the offer was formally transmitted to Moscow. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus for Lieutenant Yakov D. Zhugashvili. The stage was now set for the most terrible and personal decision of Joseph Stalin's life. The prize in the cage was now the center of the world. The message from the International Red Cross landed in Moscow with the force of a delayed action bomb. It was not delivered directly to Stalin's desk. Such things never were. It filtered up through the labyrinthine channels of the NKVD, vetted and analyzed by Lavrentiy Beria, the secret police chief whose spectacles hid the eyes of a reptile. Beria, a man who understood the nuances of power and cruelty better than most, would have known the exquisite trap this offer represented. He presented it to Stalin not in the grandiose setting of the Kremlin office, but likely in a quieter moment, perhaps during a late-night report in the Vajd's nearby apartment. The setting itself was a message. This was not a matter of state, but a family affair. There was no dramatic pause, no anguished soul-searching witnessed by history. Stalin's reaction, as recorded by those who dared to record such things, was swift and brutal. He dismissed it out of hand. The famous apocryphal quote, "I will not trade a marshal for a lieutenant," perfectly encapsulates the cold military logic he projected. But the reality was far more complex and politically savage. He didn't just refuse, he weaponized his refusal. He invoked his own law, Order No. 270, the very decree that had condemned his son in the first place. Publicly, through the controlled mouthpieces of the state, the line was solidified. There are no prisoners of war in the Soviet Union. There are only traitors to the motherland. Stalin does not trade with traitors, not even his own kin. It was a masterstroke of political judo. Hitler's attempt to embarrass him was transformed into a demonstration of his own unwavering, almost superhuman, commitment to the cause. Behind the scenes, the machinery of the state whirred into action to cement this narrative. The propaganda apparatus, which had spent months erasing Yakov from existence, now began to quietly weave a new, darker myth. Whispers were cultivated, stories planted in soldiers' newspapers and party meetings. The tale was not of a captured son, but of a sacrificed son. Our great leader, the narrative implied, suffers as we suffer. He has given his own flesh and blood to the struggle against fascism. What excuse do any of us have to hold back? It was a chillingly effective piece of emotional manipulation. Stalin, the distant, terrifying God-king, was suddenly humanized, not through an act of love, but through an act of supreme shared sacrifice. His personal coldness was repackaged as national fortitude. The refusal was not a father's failure, but a leader's ultimate gift to his people. For Yakov, isolated in the increasingly bleak environment of Sachsenhausen concentration camp, where he had been transferred to a special compound for prominent prisoners, the news of his father's decision must have been the final, shattering blow. All prisoners live on hope, the hope of exchange, of rescue, of the war ending. For Yakov, that hope had a name and a face, however stern. Now that hope was extinguished. He was truly alone. His existence had been formally invalidated by the one man whose approval, however impossibly, he may have still sought. The other prisoners in his special barrack, a mix of British officers, political dissidents, and other Soviet specials, noted the change in him. The quiet dignity he had maintained began to crumble. He became more withdrawn, his eyes hollowed with a despair that went beyond the physical deprivations of the camp. The Germans, meanwhile, were infuriated by Stalin's refusal. Goebbels' propagandists had expected either a propaganda victory or a propaganda victory. They believed they couldn't lose. Instead, Stalin had turned the tables. The field marshal for a lieutenant offer was now an embarrassment for them. It highlighted their own desperation following Stalingrad and demonstrated a fanatical resolve on the Soviet side that they found both baffling and terrifying. Their treatment of Yakov shifted. The offers of comfort and collaboration ceased. He was now a useless asset, a symbol of their failed psychological warfare. The guards, sensing the shift in attitude from their superiors, likely became more brutal, more dismissive. The special prisoner was now just another untermensch who had outlived his usefulness. In Moscow, the personal fallout continued. Yakov's wife, Yulia, remained in the Lubyanka. Her imprisonment was a living testament to the ruthlessness of the decree. Stalin's daughter, Svetlana, years later would recall the painful ambiguity of those days. She remembered her father being genuinely grief-stricken at times, once muttering, "Yasha couldn't even shoot straight," a haunting echo of the earlier suicide attempt. But these were private, fleeting moments, quickly buried beneath the immense burdens of running the war. Was there a flicker of the father beneath the vajda? Or was his grief not for the son, but for the political inconvenience his son had become? The historical record offers no clear answers, only the stark, uncontestable fact of the refusal. The winter of 1942-1943 turned to spring. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army, energized by the victory at Stalingrad, began a massive push westward. The tide of the war was irrevocably turning. In his camp, Yakov D. Zhugashvili was a man caught in a riptide of history, ideology, and personal tragedy. He was a pawn that had been sacrificed, a son disowned by his father, a soldier condemned by his own command. The world outside was moving on, leaving him behind in his barbed wire purgatory. The calculus was complete. The father of nations had made his choice, and in doing so, he had sealed a fate that was now hurtling towards its terrible, inevitable conclusion. The question was no longer if Yakov would die, but how, and what his final, lonely act would say about the two monstrous regimes that had claimed his life. Sachsenhausen was not just a prison. It was a factory of despair, a geometrically precise monument to Nazi cruelty. Located just north of Berlin, its semicircular layout was designed for total surveillance, a panopticon where every emaciated prisoner felt the watchtower's eye upon them. In the spring of 1943, Yakov D. Zhugashvili was a ghost in this machine of death. He had been moved to a special compound within the camp, the Sonderlager, reserved for prominent prisoners, a bizarre assortment of defeated European generals, British spies, and political curiosities like himself. Here, the physical brutality was often more subtle than in the main camp, but the psychological torment was refined to a razor's edge. The prisoners were men who had once held power, now reduced to irrelevance, their lives sustained only for their potential utility or symbolic value. For Yakov, that value had evaporated with his father's refusal. His existence became a tightrope walk over an abyss of shame and fury. The other prisoners in the Sonderlager were a constant reminder of his pariah status. The British officers, in particular, with their stubborn adherence to class and discipline, even in captivity, found him an enigma. Conversations around the sparse meals were a minefield. They spoke of the war news, gleaned from clandestine radios and new arrivals, of the Allied victories in North Africa and the Soviet advances. To them, Stalingrad was a turning point, a cause for quiet celebration. To Yakov, it was the battle that had sealed his fate, the victory for which he had been ritually sacrificed. Every positive report from the Eastern Front was a fresh lash, confirming that the motherland was winning precisely because his father had been willing to leave him to rot. The tension in the barrack was palpable. The British, products of a military culture that viewed surrender as a misfortune, not a sin, could not comprehend the weight of Stalin's Order No. 270 that hung around Yakov's neck. They saw a brooding, difficult man. He saw in them a world that would never understand his. The most infamous incident, the one that would precipitate the final crisis, was a quarrel over a simple human impulse, a game of cards. On the evening of April 14, 1943, a group of British officers, including Wing Commander Harry Day, were playing a hand. Yakov, who had been pacing restlessly, watched them with growing agitation. The exact words exchanged are lost to history, filtered through the biases of memory and the fog of war, but the core of the argument is consistent. The British officers, perhaps frustrated with his gloomy presence or trying to goad him out of his shell, made a taunting remark. It might have been about the Soviet Union's military tactics, about his father, or simply a crude joke about Russians. For Yakov, it was the spark on a powder keg. He exploded. The quiet, withdrawn lieutenant was gone, replaced by a man possessed by a lifetime of accumulated humiliation. He shouted at them, his voice raw with pain. The specifics of his rant are unrecorded, but the themes can be imagined. The condescension of the West, their late entry into the war, their inability to grasp the scale of sacrifice on the Eastern Front where millions were dying to save their skins. And then the most personal wound. My father believes I am a traitor. You believe I am a barbarian. I have no country. I have no father. What am I? The British officers, stunned by the outburst, reportedly told him to calm down, to shut up. One of them, in a final, dismissive insult, supposedly told him he was as bad as the Germans or that he was not worth arguing with. This was the breaking point. If his own father had disowned him, and his allies in this joint struggle despised him, then where did he belong? The last vestiges of his identity, the son, the soldier, the Soviet citizen, shattered. He turned from the barrack and stormed out into the compound's twilight, a man unmoored from all human connection. He began pacing near the perimeter fence, a single, agitated figure moving in the no-man's land between the barracks and the wire. The guards in Tower 4 watched him. This was not unusual. Prisoners often walked the boundaries of their cage, tracing the limits of their world. But Yakov's pace was different, frantic, erratic, a panther in a trap. What happened next, in the moments before 2100 hours, is the central, unanswerable mystery of his story. The official German report, filed by the camp commandant and swiftly forwarded to Himmler's SS headquarters, stated the facts with bureaucratic coldness. Prisoner Yakov D. Zhugashvili, in a state of extreme agitation, refused the order to halt. He screamed at the guard, "Shoot me." He then made a sudden, deliberate dash for the electrified barbed wire fence, climbed onto it, and was instantly electrocuted. The guard, Corporal Conrad Hafrich, having given the required warning, then fired a single fatal shot into his head. The death was ruled a suicide, a case of self-induced death. But the other prisoners in the Sonderlager whispered a different story. They spoke of a provocation, of a guard, perhaps bored, perhaps malicious, egging on the obviously distressed prisoner. They wondered if Yakov, in his distraught state, had simply wandered too close to the forbidden zone, the Grenzbereich, and the trigger-happy Halfrich had seized the opportunity. Was it a deliberate suicide, a final act of agency by a man who could no longer bear the weight of his existence? Or was it a shot while trying to escape, a convenient way for the SS to dispose of a now troublesome prisoner who reminded them of their own failed propaganda ploy? The truth died with Yakov on the wire. His body, according to camp procedure, was cremated in the Sachsenhausen ovens. The ashes of Joseph Stalin's eldest son were scattered anonymously, lost amidst the anonymous smoke of the Holocaust. When the news was relayed to Berlin, and then, through intelligence channels, to Moscow, it was met with a final, resounding silence. There was no acknowledgement from the Kremlin, no expression of grief, no request for the body. For Stalin, Yakov had ceased to exist the moment he was captured. His physical death was merely a formality. The son's long, painful reckoning was over. But for the father, and for the hundreds of thousands of Soviet POWs who shared Yakov's stigma, the consequences of this single, tragic life were only just beginning to unfold. The wire at Sachsenhausen had claimed its most symbolic victim, but the ideological wires that had truly killed him stretched all the way to the heart of the Kremlin. The news of Yakov D. Zhugashvili's death did not ripple across the world. It was absorbed into the silent, cynical machinery of two totalitarian regimes. In Berlin, the report from Sachsenhausen was filed away, a minor administrative closure to a failed propaganda venture. For the Nazis, Yakov had been a weapon that had jammed in their hands. His death was an inconvenience, a loose end tied up with a single gunshot. There would be no grand announcement. To reveal that Stalin's son had died in a concentration camp, whether by suicide or guard fire, offered no strategic advantage. It was a non-event, and they treated it as such. In Moscow, the silence was even more profound. No telegram of condolence arrived at the Kremlin. No black-bordered announcement appeared in Pravda. Stalin, who had already buried his son ideologically with the refusal of the exchange, now buried him in fact with a silence that was more deafening than any lament. To acknowledge Yakov's death would be to acknowledge his life as a prisoner, to admit the failure and the truth the state had spent years suppressing. The official fiction, that Lieutenant D. Zhugashvili had died heroically in combat in 1941, was allowed to stand, a brittle lie that would remain the Soviet Union's official position for decades. In the inner circle, not a word was spoken. It was as if Yakov had never existed. The one known, poignant consequence was the release of his wife, Yulia, from the Lubyanka. With Yakov's death, the legal justification for her imprisonment under Order No. 270 evaporated. She was freed into a life of quiet obscurity, a living ghost haunted by a husband whose fate she could never openly mourn. But if the leaders refused to speak of Yakov, his story, and the brutal principle it embodied, seeped deep into the bone marrow of the Soviet war effort. The D. Zhugashvili precedent became an unspoken, terrifying addendum to Order No. 270. Every political officer, every Zamplet attached to a Red Army unit, understood the lesson. If the Vajd's own son was not spared the stigma of surrender, then no one was. The message to the troops was unequivocal: you are more valuable to the motherland dead than alive in captivity. This doctrine manifested in the most brutal tactics on the battlefield. Blocking detachments, Zagrada Triadi, of NKVD troops stationed behind front-line units were authorized to shoot any soldier who retreated without orders. The concept of a fighting retreat was viewed with intense suspicion. Often, it was simpler and safer for the commanders to order units to stand and die in place. For the millions of ordinary Soviet soldiers who were captured in the Great Encirclements of 1941-42, Yakov's fate was their fate, writ large. They were the forgotten, the forsaken. When the tide of war turned and the Red Army began liberating the vast POW camps in Poland and Germany in 1944-45, the soldiers who stumbled out, emaciated and bearing the horrors of Nazi captivity, were not greeted as heroes. They were not embraced as survivors. They were viewed as contaminants. They had been exposed to the outside world, to foreign ideas, to the simple fact of their own survival when so many had died. In the eyes of the state, this made them politically unreliable. The process was called filtration. It was a system of bureaucratic brutality. Liberated POWs were not sent home. They were rounded up by Smersh counterintelligence units and dispatched to special NKVD camps, often the very same facilities that had held political prisoners before the war. Here they were subjected to weeks, sometimes months, of relentless interrogation. The questions were circular and paranoid. Why did you surrender? Why didn't you fight to the death? Who else in your unit surrendered? What did you tell the Germans? What did you see abroad? Who tried to recruit you? The goal was not to uncover genuine spies, though some were found, but to enforce ideological purity and assign collective guilt. The scale was staggering. Of the approximately 1.8 million Soviet POWs repatriated by the Allies after the war, an estimated over 1 million were sentenced to terms in the Gulag. Others were assigned to penal battalions or forced labor battalions for years. They were stripped of their veterans' rights, their pensions, their honor. They became a ghost army, a hidden shame in the triumphant narrative of the Great Patriotic War. Their crime was the same as Yakov's. They had survived when the state had demanded their death. The wire of Sachsenhausen that had killed Stalin's son was, in a metaphysical sense, replicated around the entire Soviet Union, a barrier of suspicion that separated the pure heroes from the stained survivors. This policy had a devastating human cost, but from the regime's perspective, it served a cold purpose. It reasserted total state control over the narrative of the war. It prevented the formation of a class of veterans with independent experiences who had seen the relative prosperity of Eastern Europe and might question the Soviet system. It crushed any potential source of dissent before it could coalesce. The triumph of 1945 was to be Stalin's triumph alone, built on the uncomplaining sacrifice of millions. The returning POWs, with their stories of suffering and survival, complicated that simple story. They were living proof that the state's demand for total sacrifice was, for some, an impossible burden. And so they had to be erased, just as Yakov had been erased. Thus, the legacy of Yakov D. Zhugashvili extended far beyond his own tragic end. He became the archetype for every Soviet soldier who ever raised his hands in surrender. His father's refusal had not just been a personal choice. It had been a statement of policy, one that would condemn countless others to a second imprisonment after their first had ended. The victory over Nazism was secured by incredible courage and sacrifice, but it was also built on a foundation of profound state cruelty, a cruelty that began at the top, in the heart of a father who chose the state over his son, and in doing so, gave permission for the state to devour its own. The stain of surrender, first applied to the lieutenant in the German camp, now spread across an entire generation, a dark shadow on the bright red victory banner. The stark, solitary figure of Joseph Stalin, sacrificing his son on the altar of state necessity, stands in chilling isolation when placed against the backdrop of other wartime leaders. The story of Yakov D. Zhugashvili gains its full, horrifying resonance not in a vacuum, but when heard as a dissonant chord in a chorus of contrasting approaches to family, loyalty, and the value of a single life amidst the global carnage. While the Eastern Front was defined by an ideological war of annihilation, the Western Allies navigated a different, though still brutal, set of principles where individual survival was not automatically equated with treason. Perhaps the most poignant contrast lies not with a leader, but with a common soldier's father. While Stalin was invoking Order No. 270, millions of other families across the Soviet Union were receiving the same brutal treatment, arrests, and stigma for the crime of a son's capture. Their silent, private grief was a national tragedy, magnified but not unique to the Kremlin. Yet, beyond the Soviet sphere, a different reality existed. In the United States, the family of a captured soldier might receive a telegram from the War Department, its language formal but not accusatory. Community newspapers would list them as missing in action or prisoner of war, and their families would often lead local drives to send care packages through the Red Cross. The captured soldier was a victim of circumstance, not a pariah. This divergence was crystallized at the very top. Consider President Franklin D. Roosevelt. His 4 sons all saw active, dangerous military service. His eldest, James, served with the Marines in the Pacific as a Raider Battalion commander, a role of immense physical risk. His son Elliot flew daring reconnaissance missions as a pilot in the Army Air Forces. The Roosevelt boys were not coddled, they were in the thick of the fight. While they were never captured, the very public nature of their service, and the nation's pride in it, stood in stark opposition to the Soviet secrecy surrounding Yakov. Had one of the Roosevelt sons been taken prisoner, it would have been a national news story, likely met with public concern and official efforts to ensure their well-being through neutral channels. The idea of the president publicly disowning his son and leaving him to his fate is inconceivable in the American context. It would have been political and personal suicide. Then, there was Winston Churchill. His relationship with his children was complex and often troubled, but his actions spoke to a different code. His only son, Randolph, was a tempestuous figure who served with the SAS and saw action in North Africa and Yugoslavia. He was headstrong and often a political liability, but he was never disowned. Churchill feared for his life, mourned his mistakes, and supported him, even when it was personally exasperating. More directly, Churchill's family was touched by the war in a way that highlights the absurdity of Order No. 270. His son-in-law, Vic Oliver, was an Austrian-born entertainer, but more pertinently, his daughter Mary's future husband, Christopher Soames, served and was wounded. The concept of punishing the Churchill family for the capture or wounding of one of their own was anathema to the British spirit. The British government, in fact, went to extraordinary lengths for its prisoners, orchestrating complex escape networks and famously repatriating seriously wounded POWs in exchanges. The most direct and dramatic counterpoint to Stalin's refusal, however, came from his own Axis rival, Adolf Hitler. In September 1943, after Italy's surrender, German forces launched a daring commando raid, led by the notorious Otto Skorzeny, to rescue the deposed Benito Mussolini from his mountain-top hotel prison at Gran Sasso. The operation was audacious, risky, a ND Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Hitler did not abandon his captured ally. He sent his best men to get him back, viewing Mussolini's symbolic value as worth the cost and the risk to the elite troops involved. The propaganda film of a liberated Mussolini embracing his saviors was broadcast worldwide. The message was clear: we do not abandon our own. The Fuhrer would move mountains to retrieve his fellow dictator, while the Vajda would not lift a finger to save his own flesh and blood. This comparison was not lost on contemporaries. German propagandists, even after Yakov's death, used it internally to mock Stalin's barbarism. The Bolshevik beast is so inhuman, one internal memo sneered, it devours its own young. For the Nazi leadership, steeped in a twisted cult of blood and lineage, Stalin's act was not a sign of strength, but of a profound, subhuman degeneracy. It confirmed their ideological belief that they were fighting a bestial enemy with no concept of honor or family. These contrasts reveal that Stalin's decision was not an inevitable product of total war, but a specific product of totalitarian ideology. The Western democracies, for all their mobilization and sacrifice, maintained a core belief in the individual's intrinsic value. Their systems, however imperfect, were built on the idea of consent and the protection of citizens' rights, which extended, however abstractly, to their soldiers. The Soviet state and the Nazi state in its own way subsumed the individual completely into the collective. For Stalin, the Soviet Union was an extension of his own will, and every citizen, including his son, was a disposable instrument of that will. His refusal was the ultimate expression of this principle. The story of Yakov, therefore, is not just a Soviet story. It is a story that holds up a dark mirror to the entire war, forcing us to examine the fundamental values for which each side fought. The Allies fought for a world where freedom and individual dignity could survive. The Axis fought for a world of racial hierarchy and brutal domination, and Stalin's USSR fought for a world where the state was all, and the individual was nothing. The lonely death of one lieutenant in a concentration camp proved that, in this grim contest of ideologies, the Soviet leadership was willing to practice on its own people a form of psychological warfare even more devastating than that of the Nazis. The chorus of contrasts does not soften the tragedy of Yakov D. Zhugashvili. It sharpens it into a universal warning about the price of absolute power and the chilling silence that follows when a father fails to be a father. For years, the official story stood, a granite monument to a lie. Lieutenant Yakov D. Zhugashvili, son of the Vazd, had fallen in battle against the Nazis in the summer of 1941, a heroic and fitting end for the offspring of a wartime leader. This was the history inscribed in Soviet encyclopedias, taught in schools, and embedded in the collective consciousness of a nation that had been conditioned to accept the state's version of reality without question. The truth, the capture, the refusal, the despair in Sachsenhausen was a phantom, a ghost story whispered only in the most intimate and trusted of circles, a dangerous knowledge that could lead to a midnight knock on the door. The silence surrounding Yakov was as total as any the NKVD could impose. This enforced amnesia began to crack, not with a roar, but with a careful, calculated whisper. The de-Stalinization campaign, initiated by Nikita Khrushchev after his secret speech in 1956, sought to dismantle the cult of the former dictator. It was a perilous balancing act, denouncing Stalin's crimes while preserving the legitimacy of the Communist Party and the narrative of the Great Patriotic War. In this context, the story of Yakov was a double-edged sword. It perfectly illustrated Stalin's personal cruelty, but it also risked exposing the brutal, systemic policy of Order No. 270 that had condemned so many others. The first tentative acknowledgments were therefore vague. Hints were dropped in memoirs of retired generals, published with the censor's approval. It was suggested that Yakov had indeed been captured, and that Stalin had behaved with, as one account carefully phrased it, an excess of ideological rigidity. The full, horrifying details of the proposed exchange and his death were still buried deep in classified German and Soviet archives. The real exhumation of Yakov's story began in the West. With the end of the war, captured German documents were meticulously catalogued by Allied intelligence. Among them were the Sachsenhausen Guard reports, the propaganda ministry files on their high-value prisoner, and the communications regarding Hitler's exchange offer. Western historians, first in the 1950s, and then with greater confidence in the 1960s and 70s, began to piece together the narrative. Books like William Shirer's The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich presented the field marshal for a lieutenant anecdote to a global audience, cementing it as a defining parable of Stalin's ruthlessness. For the West, the story was a perfect Cold War tool. It demonized the Soviet leader while humanizing his victims, even the one within his own family. Inside the Soviet Union, however, the ghost could not be so easily laid to rest. The story persisted in the Samizdat underground, clandestinely typed and carbon-copied manuscripts passed from hand to hand. It became a secret history, a truth known but unspoken. For the families of the hundreds of thousands of Soviet POWs who had been filtered into the Gulag, Yakov's fate was a dark validation of their own suffering. Their loved ones had been victims not of a singular monster's whim, but of a system whose logic demanded such sacrifices. The lieutenant's tragedy was their tragedy, magnified by his name but identical in its essence. The final, official unveiling of the truth had to wait for the collapse of the system itself. During the glasnost and perestroika reforms of the late 1980s, the floodgates of history burst open. Archives that had been sealed for half a century were pried open by courageous journalists and historians. In 1990, the Soviet weekly magazine Ogniak, a beacon of the new openness, published a comprehensive investigation into Yakov's fate, reprinting the German documents and witness testimonies from Sachsenhausen. For the first time, the Soviet public saw the photograph of a haggard Yakov in captivity and read the cold text of the exchange offer. The heroic lie was shattered, replaced by a truth that was, in its own way, even more powerful and tragic. The post-Soviet era allowed for a more nuanced and profoundly sad reconciliation with Yakov's memory. His daughter, Yakov D. Zhugashvili, who had grown up with the heroic myth of her father's death in combat, spent decades fighting to rehabilitate his name and uncover the truth. She petitioned for access to files, gave interviews, and sought to reclaim her father not as a political symbol, but as a man, a sensitive, flawed individual crushed between the millstones of history. In a poignant twist, she eventually sought and received official confirmation from the Russian Federation that his death was not a cowardly suicide, but the result of provocation by the camp guards, a posthumous effort to restore a soldier's honor that his own nation had denied him. The historical debate, however, continues to rage. Was Stalin's refusal an act of monstrous personal cruelty, the final act in a lifetime of paternal failure? Or was it a cold, calculating, and ultimately correct political decision? Some historians argue that to have traded Paulus for Yakov would have shattered the Soviet war ethos at its most critical hour. It would have signaled that the elite could play by different rules, that the son of the leader was worth more than 100,000 common soldiers. In a war sustained by the belief in universal sacrifice, such a breach could have been catastrophic for morale. From this perspective, Stalin sacrificed his son to the same god of war to which he sacrificed millions of others. A terrible, but coherent, logic. Yet, this justification rests on the acceptance of the totalitarian premise itself, that the state is all, and the individual is nothing. The enduring power of Yakov's story lies in its ability to force us to reject that premise. It is a story that transcends the specifics of the Eastern Front and becomes a universal meditation on the limits of power, the claims of family, and the price of ideology. The unquiet grave of Yakov D. Zhugashvili refuses to be silenced because it asks a question that echoes through the ages. What, in the end, is the value of a single human life? For Stalin, the answer was clear. It was a coin to be spent. For the rest of humanity, Yakov's tragedy stands as a permanent rebuke to that answer, a ghost at the feast of history, reminding us that even in the face of absolute power, the claims of a single soul cannot be entirely extinguished. His story is no longer just a Soviet story. It is a warning written in the blood of a son, forever unfinished, forever unquiet. The final act of the story of Joseph and Yakov Stalin was not written in the electrified wire of Sachsenhausen or the bustling corridors of the Kremlin, but in the long, slow reckoning of history itself. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the myth-making apparatus that had sustained the heroic lie was dismantled, brick by ideological brick. The statues of the Vajda were torn down, the archives were opened, and the ghosts were invited in from the cold. In this new light, the figure of Yakov D. Zhugashvili underwent a profound transformation. He was no longer just a propaganda tool, a cautionary tale, or a secret shame. He became something far more powerful and human, a symbol of the countless individual souls crushed beneath the wheels of the 20th century's great ideological machines. The story's enduring power lies in its stark, almost biblical simplicity. It is a parable of a father who sacrifices his son. In this, it touches upon the deepest, most primal fears and bonds of human experience. We understand, on an instinctual level, the profound violation of this act. Stalin's refusal was not merely a political decision. It was a fundamental perversion of the natural order. He inverted the ancient, universal contract where a parent protects a child, and in doing so, he revealed the terrifying core of his worldview, that the abstract concept of the state was more real, more sacred, than the flesh and blood reality of his own family. This was the ultimate demand of totalitarianism. Not just your loyalty, not just your labor, but your very humanity, your most intimate connections were property of the regime. For the Russian people, and for the survivors of the Soviet experiment, Yakov's story became a key to unlocking a more honest and more painful understanding of their own past. The narrative of the Great Patriotic War had been one of unified, heroic sacrifice, a sacred struggle where the entire nation stood as one. Yakov's tragedy introduced a crack of dissonance into this triumphant chorus. It whispered of a different kind of sacrifice, not the voluntary offering of a citizen for his homeland, but the compulsory consumption of individuals by a state that viewed them as expendable resources. He became the patron saint of all those who did not fit the heroic mold, the prisoners of war, the families of traitors, the shamed, the silenced, the filtered. His story gave a name and a face to the millions of anonymous sufferings that had been airbrushed from the official portrait of victory. Historians will forever debate the cold calculus of Stalin's decision. The strength argument persists in the context of a war of annihilation, where the very existence of the nation was at stake. Any sign of weakness, any hint of nepotism could have been catastrophic. By applying his own brutal law to his own son, Stalin arguably strengthened the resolve of an army reeling from initial defeat. He embodied the terrible, unwavering consistency the moment demanded. Yet, this argument is a prisoner of its own premise. It accepts that such a choice was ever necessary, that the total erasure of personal morality is the price of survival. To justify Stalin is to justify the world that made him necessary. The truer, more lasting legacy of Yakov D. Zhugashvili is the refutation of that very world. His life and death stand as a permanent testament to the idea that there is a line that must not be crossed, that some costs are too high to pay, even for victory. It forces us to ask, what is a nation if not its people? What is a cause if it requires you to become a monster to defend it? The Soviet Union won the war, but in acts like this, it lost a piece of its soul. The victory was real. The sacrifice of the common soldier was immense and heroic, but the philosophy that governed from the top was one that could not distinguish between a soldier and a statistic, between a son and a pawn. In the end, the most poignant memory comes not from a document or a debate, but from a fleeting human moment, reported by Stalin's daughter Svetlana in her memoirs. Years after the war, long after Yakov's death, she was rummaging through her father's desk and found a packet of photographs. Among them was a picture of Yakov. Her father, an old man by then, had taken it from her and stared at it for a long, silent time. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken regrets, he muttered, "What a foolish boy! What a foolish boy!" It was not an apology. It was not an expression of love, but it was an acknowledgement. In that quiet, private sigh, the man of steel, for just an instant, was simply a father, confronted with the ghost of a son he could never understand and a loss he could never publicly mourn. The wire at Sachsenhausen is gone now. The Soviet Union is gone. The ideologies that sent millions to their deaths have been consigned to the history books. But the question posed by the short, tragic life of Yakov D. Zhugashvili remains as urgent as ever. It is the question of where we draw the line between the collective and the individual, between the cause and the conscience, between the state and the single, irreplaceable soul. His story is a monument not of stone, but of a warning, that when we grant absolute power to abstractions, the nation, the class, the race, we risk losing sight of the very people we claim to serve. And in that loss, we all become prisoners, pacing the boundaries of our own humanity, waiting for a sign of mercy that never comes. The single soul had been offered up, and the world was left to ponder the price.